While most of the world's attention is currently fixated on the part of the war in the Middle East taking place across Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, there's a separate, potentially even more consequential theater of operations in the long term that's also taking place in Lebanon, that could end up resulting in a permanent change in borders. 2 days after the US and Israel started the war in Iran by killing Iran's former supreme leader in a missile strike, Hezbollah, a heavily armed paramilitary and political party in Lebanon that is strongly supported by Iran with arms and cash, decided to retaliate by firing rockets and drones into northern Israel again for the first time since they had agreed to a ceasefire with Israel after the last war between them ended in late 2024. And since then, full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah has returned back to Lebanon once again. And this time, it'll likely have much worse consequences than even any prior fighting between them did. Israel has since conducted hundreds of heavy airstrikes all across Lebanon in a campaign they have said is targeting Hezbollah, while Hezbollah has fired more than 1,000 rockets and drones into northern Israel at the same time. In the middle of March, the Israeli ground forces launched a renewed invasion across the border into southern Lebanon with a stated goal of pushing Hezbollah away from their border once and for all. And then, most escalatory of all, Israel's defense minister stated plainly on the final day of March that Israel's current military objective is to seize control over all of the territory in southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, some 30 kilometers or 19 miles deep into Lebanon away from the Israeli border, which is all a chunk of land that represents roughly 10% of Lebanon's entire sovereign territory. Shortly before this announcement, the Israeli military also ordered the entire Lebanese population that lives within this territory and beyond up to the Zaharani River to evacuate further northwards, with additional evacuation orders given for the Shiite-majority southern suburbs of the capital, Beirut. Some 600,000 Lebanese people have since been reported to have fled their homes in the south from below the Litani River, and another 400,000 more from between the Litani and the Zaharani rivers and from the southern suburbs of Beirut, the overwhelming majority of whom are members of Lebanon's Shiite community, and which collectively represents the largest forced displacement of people in Lebanon's entire modern history that is affecting roughly 1 in 6 people in the whole country. The Israeli defense minister has since openly stated that after his country finishes its occupation of southern Lebanon beneath the Litani River, Israel will continue occupying it as a so-called buffer zone, even after the current war with Hezbollah and Iran concludes, until an undetermined point in the future when Israel feels confident that the threat posed by Hezbollah to northern Israel is ended for good. With no clear timeline established for how long that could potentially be, it has led to fears within Lebanon that the Israelis are moving towards an indefinite, open-ended occupation of the south of their country again, like they did for nearly 2 decades between 1982 and 2000. Or, even worse, towards a full-on permanent annexation of all of the land instead. Fears that are not being assuaged by the ongoing rhetoric and actions taking place within the halls of the highest authorities in Israel. The Israeli defense minister has explicitly stated that absolutely none of the some 600,000 Lebanese residents who have fled from the area south of the Litani River will be allowed to return home again until the open-ended mission of ensuring the security of northern Israel is accomplished. Meaning, in other words, that there is no clear timeline for when or even if they will be allowed to return again. The defense minister has also added that in order to root out Hezbollah from the border area once and for all, the Israeli military will have to conduct operations based on the model they pursued in Rafah and Beit Hanun in Gaza, meaning that they're going to completely demolish and raze all of the Lebanese villages that border Israel down to the ground. Israel might consider this militarily important in order to remove any structure along the border that Hezbollah could use to fortify or store rockets in. But to most everyone in Lebanon right now, it also looks like Israel is laying the groundwork to eventually annex this territory beneath the Litani River. And those fears haven't been helped by the comments of Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, either. Just a week before, the defense minister said that Israel was going to occupy all of the territory beneath the Litani for an indefinite amount of time, Smotrich said plainly during an interview on the radio that the new Israeli border needed to be expanded up to the Litani River in the war's aftermath, effectively arguing that the same area of Lebanon currently being invaded and occupied in the name of rooting out Hezbollah should be formally annexed and incorporated directly into Israel, the same way that the Golan Heights were previously from Syria. Indeed, after repeatedly having come under attack from the Golan Heights by the Syrian army, Israel eventually counterattacked and occupied the territory under similar arguments about transforming it into a temporary buffer zone in 1967 to defend the homeland. only to then allow Israeli settlers to begin moving in later that led to Israel formally annexing the buffer zone 14 years later in 1981. And now, many in Lebanon fear that the precedent set by the Golan Heights is being applied to the south of their country next in real time. Officials at the UN have even warned in recent weeks that the world should be preparing itself for an imminent new addition to the list of Israeli-occupied territories in the Middle East. And in order to understand how we even got here and what it means for the future, let's just rewind back a few years ago in order to gain some context. Even before the start of this current war, Lebanon as a country was teetering on the brink of collapse and had been devastated by years of compounding crises and wars with Israel. Going back to 2019, Lebanon suffered one of modern history's most severe financial crises when an unprecedented banking crisis contributed to a catastrophic 90% collapse of the country's currency value, which wiped out the majority of savings for millions of Lebanese residents. The financial crisis led to Lebanon defaulting on its sovereign debt for the first time in its history in 2020, and led to the country's GDP collapsing by more than 40% in one of the top 3 worst financial implosions that any society has seen since the 19th century. And then, just months after that, a massive explosion rocked the port in Beirut, the country's capital city, which killed more than 200 people and, according to the World Bank, caused more than $8 billion in financial damages, equivalent to nearly a third of Lebanon's entire remaining GDP by that point, that triggered a firestorm of criticism against the government on accusations of corruption and mismanagement. And then, just a few years later in 2023, in this environment of an already deep crisis for the country, Hamas launched its October 7th attack on Israel from Gaza, which led to Hezbollah deciding to almost immediately join the war in support of Hamas by firing rockets across the border into northern Israel, which in effect dragged the entire rest of the country of Lebanon into the war as well, whether they wanted to or not. Hezbollah is a powerful militia, paramilitary, and political party within Lebanon that has long functioned as essentially a state within the state. Hezbollah's base of support overwhelmingly comes from Lebanon's Shiite Muslim population, who represent roughly 27% of the country's total population and who make up regional majorities in South Lebanon immediately across the border from Israel, as well as in the fertile Bekaa Valley that makes up Lebanon's most valuable farmland, and in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Hezbollah was originally formed as a Shiite resistance militia back in 1982, after Israel invaded Lebanon for the first time in response to attacks that were then coming from southern Lebanon by Palestinian militants, and after they came to occupy a swath of southern Lebanon as a so-called buffer zone. Hezbollah and the Lebanese Shiite community more broadly each came to see this Israeli occupation in the south as an occupation of historically Shiite lands, and fought bitterly over the next 18 years to push the Israelis out, while they began receiving heavy financial and military support from their natural ally, Iran, as well. Israel eventually withdrew from the occupation zone in South Lebanon in 2000, but Hezbollah was able to maintain its position within Lebanon as a heavily armed Iranian proxy force beyond the reach of the central government. And then they entered into another war with Israel in 2006. That war only lasted for about a month before a ceasefire went into effect, including the now infamous UN Resolution 1701, which called for Hezbollah to fully withdraw away from the Israeli border to the north of the Litani River, and for the eventual disarmament of Hezbollah as an organization, with the implication that it was up to the Lebanese government to actually enforce it. But for 2 decades since then, the Lebanese government has either never enforced it or only half-heartedly enforced it. Not necessarily out of a lack of will, but out of a deep fear of what trying to do so would actually mean. You have to understand that Lebanon doesn't really work the same way that a normal country does. Lebanon is an immensely diverse country in terms of religious beliefs, where roughly 55% of the country are Muslims, evenly divided between Sunnis and Shiites. Another 40.5% of the population are Christians, divided between a variety of different sects, while another 4.5% are Druze. Lebanon suffered a devastating sectarian civil war between all of these groups for nearly 15 years between 1975 and 1990 that killed more than 100,000 people and ended with the country establishing a delicate balance of power between all of its many religious groups to try and put as much of a lid on the internal tensions going forward as possible. Under this convoluted system, the country's president must always be a Maronite Catholic Christian. The Prime Minister, always a Sunni Muslim. The Speaker of Parliament, always a Shiite Muslim. The Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, always a Greek Orthodox Christian. The Deputy Prime Minister, also always a Greek Orthodox Christian. And the Army Chief of Staff, always a Druze. The country's parliament is similarly divided along strict sectarian lines, with 50% of all the seats reserved for the Muslims and Druze and the other 50% reserved for the Christians, that are all further strictly subdivided by sect. The Lebanese government's long fear in actually ever forcing Hezbollah to disarm itself and withdrawing north of the Litani River is that it would trigger Hezbollah and the Shiite community more broadly in the country to each revolt and re-trigger the civil war of the 1970s and 80s again. Even worse, the Lebanese government has never been sure or even optimistic that they would actually win a fight against Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is by most metrics even more powerful than the Lebanese armed forces themselves are. Hezbollah wields an annual budget of around $1 billion, $700 to $800 million of which are directly provided by the Iranian government, which is even larger than the budget afforded to the Lebanese armed forces, which only amounts to $635 million a year as of 2024, $230 million of which is also provided by the United States. Hezbollah has been able to maintain a standing army that's nearly the same size as the Lebanese armed forces, and their fighters are even better paid, better equipped, better trained, have greater real-world combat experience, and undoubtedly have higher morale and motivation and unit cohesion than the Lebanese armed forces have, since Hezbollah's fighters are almost entirely Shiites, while the Lebanese armed forces are similarly divided along sectarian lines, just like the government is. This is why it has always been viewed as extremely difficult for the Lebanese government to ever actually rein Hezbollah in, and now Hezbollah has been able to maintain a completely separate foreign policy from the rest of the government. By the time of Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack on Israel, the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel from the 2006 war was still holding. But Hezbollah had also never withdrawn to the north of the Litani River, nor had ever disarmed, while the government had never made any serious attempt to actually force them to do so. And then, Hezbollah decided to attack Israel again and drag the rest of Lebanon into a war with them during an unprecedented time of crisis that they could hardly afford. This then triggered a 13-month-long war between Hezbollah and Israel that wrought enormous devastation upon Lebanon and Hezbollah alike, that included the killing of Hezbollah's longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah and a pager attack that simultaneously blew up thousands of Hezbollah-affiliated pagers that wounded thousands of Hezbollah's officers and fighters and civilians. By the end of it in November of 2024, when the two sides finally agreed on another ceasefire, up to 5,000 of Hezbollah's fighters had been killed, 13,000 more had been wounded, and $11 billion worth of estimated damages had been inflicted all across Lebanon by the relentless Israeli aerial attacks and bombardments. Israel also conducted a more limited ground invasion of southern Lebanon this time that concluded with them largely withdrawing after the November 2024 ceasefire, save for 5 small strategic high points immediately across the border that they still maintained their control over. Additionally, under the terms of this latest November 2024 ceasefire, Hezbollah was once again supposed to disarm itself and withdraw away back to the north of the Litani River, under the supervision of the Lebanese government and army, while Israel was supposed to halt all of their attacks. Neither of them ultimately upheld their end of the agreement, however. Even though Hezbollah had been badly weakened and bloodied by the war with Israel, the Lebanese government was still afraid of the same problem it had always faced with actually confronting them. The risk that doing so would trigger a revolt among the Shiites in the country and lead to a restarting of the civil war again. The will was there, with many of the Christians, Sunnis, and Druze in Lebanon being furious with Hezbollah over them dragging the rest of the country into a devastating and expensive war with Israel against their wishes. But as usual, the actual capability of a weak and fragmented central state to confront Hezbollah was still absent. Nonetheless, some progress by the government on Hezbollah was finally being made. In February of 2025, a new government came into office in Lebanon headed by President Joseph Aoun and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam that promised to finally implement UN Resolution 1701 after nearly 2 decades. In August, this new government for the first time declared that the Lebanese state had the exclusive right to full control over all weapons within its territory, effectively declaring that Hezbollah's separate arsenal was illegal. And then the following month in September, the government ordered the Lebanese armed forces to create a plan to actually implement this policy. The new government also put substantial efforts into eliminating the flow of weapons and cash to Hezbollah coming in from abroad, and was beginning to even clamp down on Hezbollah's presence south of the Litani River. But it was still never capable of actually fully confronting Hezbollah, while Israel maintained almost daily airstrikes against Hezbollah all throughout the whole ceasefire anyway. Between November of 2024, when the last ceasefire began, and March of 2026, when it ended, continued Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon still killed around 350 Hezbollah fighters and 127 Lebanese civilians. The Israeli government was accusing the Lebanese government of not actually doing enough to clamp down on Hezbollah like they had agreed to, while the Lebanese government was accusing the Israelis of not making it any easier for them by giving Hezbollah repeated reasons for continuing to resist, by bombing them and by maintaining their small 5 occupied outposts within the country. And then, after all of this continued simmering violence after the Israelis and Americans began attacking Iran, Hezbollah decided to begin firing rockets and drones into northern Israel again in early March of 2026, which Israel was then able to use as a pretext to completely kill the ceasefire altogether. And as a piece of evidence that the Lebanese government actually was making some progress against Hezbollah, most of the rockets and drones that Hezbollah fired into Israel at this time came from north of the Litani River, rather than from the south of it. Nonetheless, Israel began dramatically ramping up its airstrikes again and initiated a full-scale ground invasion into southern Lebanon under the argument that the Lebanese government was supposedly still doing nothing to stop Hezbollah, and that the threat of Hezbollah on Israel's northern border had to be permanently removed once and for all after more than 20 years of consistently refusing to withdraw or disarm. Now, multiple things are happening in Lebanon during this current struggle between Hezbollah, the Lebanese government, and Israel. Hezbollah has now openly refused to consider disarming itself and is actively portraying its current war against Israel as an existential fight for the survival of the Shiite community within Lebanon. A narrative that's being reinforced by Israel's evacuation orders from the Shiite majority areas and threats that Shiites will not be allowed to return back to their ancestral homes south of the Litani River. Hezbollah's new leadership have plainly stated that while they know they cannot stop the Israelis from taking over southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, they are still going to fight against them anyway and make it as difficult as possible. And Israel's ground invasion, its bombing of Shiite majority areas all across the country, and its rhetoric about taking over the south of Lebanon is also fueling Hezbollah's entire purpose for existing in the first place, at a time when many in Lebanon were questioning and even doubting them. The Lebanese government, meanwhile, is now facing a mounting humanitarian crisis from the resumption of the war that is only adding on to the pile of crises that it has already been constantly experiencing since 2019. More than 1,300 people have already been killed in Lebanon since the war resumed again, while Israel's targeted evacuation orders and bombardments of Shiite majority areas have triggered the displacements of more than 1 million people, the overwhelming majority of whom are Lebanese Shiites. And this, in particular, is greatly exacerbating the delicate underlying sectarian balance and fault lines within the country. Israel has repeatedly conducted aerial assassination strikes against Hezbollah and Iranian IRGC members in the country within civilian areas like apartment buildings and hotels, which have caused considerable collateral damage to Lebanese civilians and have fueled a deepening sense of paranoia among Lebanon's Christian and Sunni communities towards the Shiites collectively. With more than 1 million Shiites fleeing their homes and seeking refuge elsewhere in the country, distrustful and paranoid Christian, Sunni, and Druze Lebanese are resorting to either vetting them or refusing them shelter outright, out of a fear of putting a target on their own backs to the Israelis if they let in Hezbollah members. And if hundreds of thousands of Shiite Lebanese are permanently disallowed from returning back to their homes again, they'll inevitably significantly change the delicate demographic balance across Lebanon's Christian, Sunni, and Druze majority areas instead, which greatly risks stoking sectarian tensions and sparking internal conflict. The Lebanese government has done their best to try and defuse the war and the crisis, but it's also largely out of their own hands now. The same day that Hezbollah began firing rockets and drones into Israel again on the 2nd of March, the Lebanese government for the first time declared an explicit ban on Hezbollah's military activities in the country, expelled all of the members of Iran's IRGC from the country, ended all of their visa-free agreements with Iran, and even withdrew their ambassador from Iran. They have also called for direct negotiations with Israel to end the war, something that the Lebanese government has consistently refused to do for decades now. In response, and for declining to respond against the Israeli invasion directly, Hezbollah's leadership have openly accused the Lebanese government of committing treason, and the government is stuck between a rock and a hard place. If it pushes too hard back against Israel's invasion, it looks like they are siding with Hezbollah, and the vastly more powerful Israeli military will turn their guns on them too. And they'll also risk losing more than a third of their military budget that comes from Israel's top ally, the United States. And if they push back too hard against Hezbollah, the Shiite population in the country will increasingly perceive them to be traitors and risks pushing the whole country into a civil war. Thus, the best option for the Lebanese government has basically been what it's already been for decades now: just do nothing at all. Meanwhile, and perhaps most importantly, Israel's ultimate objectives and intentions in Lebanon right now are still mysterious. The Israeli military's officials have insisted that their objectives are limited to ensuring that Hezbollah is removed from the land south of the Litani River for good, and that the establishment of a temporary Israeli-controlled buffer zone between the Litani River and the Israeli border is necessary in order to ensure this. But at the same time, as discussed at the beginning of this video, a lot of Israel's actions and rhetoric suggest that it is actually planning something much more ambitious and escalatory. If Israel had been strictly interested in just weakening Hezbollah further, they could have cooperated with the Lebanese government that was actually finally making some progress on reining them in. They could have helped to strengthen and solidify the Lebanese central government and army against Hezbollah, but they didn't and decided to act against Hezbollah unilaterally and invaded Lebanon instead. Israel's policy of ordering the evacuations of hundreds of thousands of mostly Shiite residents from the south, and its declared policy of bulldozing towns and villages along the border that'll prevent many of them from being able to return, and its recent call-up of more than 450,000 Israeli reservists, suggests that it is truly planning for a long-term, if not indefinite, occupation of South Lebanon beneath the Litani River. While members of Netanyahu's own cabinet, like Bezalel Smotrich, are already openly calling for Israel to annex the whole territory after they complete their conquest. While Netanyahu's energy minister, Eli Cohen, has similarly begun calling to scrap the landmark maritime deal between Israel and Lebanon that was sorted out in 2022, that had resolved the two countries' long-standing maritime boundary dispute, which now, seemingly, could be back in jeopardy again. Worse still, the Trump-appointed U.S. ambassador to Lebanon has made statements that the Trump administration has reportedly requested Israel to spare the fates of Lebanese Christian villages and towns in the south, but has said nothing about the fates of the Lebanese Shiite villages and towns, implying that the U.S. government is actively encouraging a policy of ethnic cleansing of the Shiites from southern Lebanon that is being pursued by Israel, a policy that will inevitably lead to a stoking of internal tensions within Lebanon's delicate sectarian balance, something that Israel itself almost certainly wants in order to ensure that Lebanon cannot mount a collective, unified response against them. To further isolate South Lebanon from the rest of the country, the Israelis also bombed and destroyed every single major bridge that crosses over the Litani River since the newest war began. The Israelis have stated that they did this in order to prevent Hezbollah from easily being able to move weapons and fighters to the front lines. But it has also effectively left South Lebanon logistically isolated from the rest of the country too, which will make Israel's potential long-term control over it significantly more easy to manage. It'll be much more difficult for the hundreds of thousands of Lebanese residents who have fled from South Lebanon to ever return without any usable bridges over the Litani River they can actually cross, and without posts set up over on the other side of it, set up by the Israeli military. While it's also effectively made it impossible for humanitarian aid to reach South Lebanon now as well. The mostly Shiite refugees who've been evacuated and forcefully displaced from the south now fear the echoes of history, and that their fate right now might end up becoming the same as what just happened to the Gazans, or what happened to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were also forced from their homes and never allowed to return again after the 1948 to 1967 wars. Israel has stated that their war in Lebanon is separate from the war in Iran, and therefore that any potential settlement and end of the war with Iran will not mean an end of the separate war in Lebanon. So the way that I see it, after the Israelis finalize their occupation of South Lebanon beneath the Litani River, 3 possible scenarios are likely going forward. First is that Israel eventually decides to withdraw after suffering too many casualties and too much pressure from Hezbollah and the international community, which I don't think is very likely. Second, Israel might eventually use its control of South Lebanon as a bargaining chip with the Lebanese government, offering to trade it back to Lebanon in return for Lebanon extending its formal recognition of Israel and firmly agreeing to rein in Hezbollah, based on a similar deal the Israelis made with Egypt in the 1980s when they returned the occupied Sinai Peninsula back to them in exchange for Egyptian recognition. And thirdly, Israel might maintain an indefinite occupation of South Lebanon, believing that its value as a militarily controlled buffer zone separating northern Israel from Hezbollah is too important to ever give up, which might eventually lead to them allowing Israeli settlers into the territory in order to establish a firmer demographic control over it, and an eventual full-on annexation of the land like they did with the Golan Heights that they occupied from Syria. And whatever ends up happening, Lebanon itself continues being pushed ever closer to the brink of complete collapse, which if it happens, will be a calamity for the entire world to have to deal with. Meanwhile, in the United States, one of the most concerning things about living here is that there are pretty weak data privacy laws and a ton of personal data that gets put out into the public record, frequently by local, state, and federal governments themselves. It's always been like that here, and it wasn't ever a huge problem before the advent of the internet. But these days, it means that people are able to turn a profit off of making it easier for other people to get your personal information, and they do. They're called people sites, and if you want to see for yourself, just search your name and address or phone numbers and you'll probably come across a bunch of these sites that list at least some of your personal information. But you also have the power to change this. You have the legal right to request that your personal data is removed from each and every one of these sites. The biggest problem is that it takes forever to actually do that. They make it as hard as possible, and you have to do it individually over and over again for every single one of the endless sites that have it. But that's a problem that this video's sponsor Incogni fixes. They'll do this entire process for you on your behalf. They constantly search through the internet for any of your personal data that's out there, and they'll go through the whole process of taking it all down, including handling any and all rejections. Letting Incogni handle all of this for you is not only great for peace of mind, but it can also really help cut down on obnoxious spam calls and emails, since it's these very same services that sell all of your data in bulk. I've been an actual customer of Incogni for years now, so I know that it really works. And I found the cost to be very well worth it. And it'll be even more worth it for you because Incogni is offering you 60% off of their annual plan when you click the button here on your screen right now, or when you go to incogni.com/reallifelore, or when you follow the link that's down below in the description, and when you use code RealLifeLore. It's a great way to help support my channel and the journalism that I'm trying to do here as well. And as always, thank you so much for watching.